Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is September 10, 2020. And 9/11 was still an inside job. It was 19 years ago, and that's what this broadcast is going to be about today. Um, if you want to know why I'm doing Socialism for All here in 2020, I would say 9/11 truth was probably the single event that radicalized me the most. It wasn't the only one. I had personal experiences, whether it was going from a very sort of normal, economically diverse, middle class elementary school to a very posh, bourgeois private school for high school, and seeing the massive class differences, and knew somebody who had an elevator in their house there between, how the rich don't live like the rest of us. That was pretty radicalizing. And also just seeing the difference in the attitudes, not only the material wealth, but the way that rich people think, believe, and act is different as well, for sure. Other experiences, but, when 9/11 happened, I was still fairly young, but I was at a point in my life where I feel like I was starting to go my own way and figure things out, and boom. I lived near to New York City at that time, and everything changed. I don't know how else to say. I actually saw 9/11 with my own eyes. I mean, the World Trade Center, not the Pentagon, or Shanksville. But I saw it. I saw World Trade Center 7 demolished. Some of you listening may not know what World Trade Center 7 was, but it was part of the World Trade Center complex. It was the third skyscraper to completely collapse onto its own footprint, didn't fall over sideways. It wasn't part of a building, part of the building fell off. It was crushed to dust, fell directly down onto itself. That's unusual would be a massive understatement. Statistically impossible. It's not impossible, it's highly improbable. Usually when buildings fall due to damage or earthquake, they topple. They do not come directly down. In fact, the entire art of taking a building down when it needs to be, replaced with another building or something, demolished, it's pretty hard. The structural engineering in reverse that needs to go into place to actually knock out the building safely without damaging things around it is difficult, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we saw with Building 7. I was not up close, but I did see, for 2 weeks after 9/11, there was a cloud of shit in the air. You could see it from 50 miles away, honestly. I remember being somewhere pretty far from the city, and it was like a week and a half at least later, and you could still see this cloud in the air of just pulverized building, which is what it was. We're going to go in this video through a number of different topics related to 9/11 and why it radicalized me. If it hasn't radicalized you even more than you are, it's going to, I believe, by the end of this video. In the 2000s, I did anti-war activism because, that's just an issue that affected me strongly. I grew up during the Cold War, and then not knowing much about socialism in those days, I thought in the 90s that the fall of the Soviet Union meant we're going to have world peace. In fact, it meant just the opposite. It meant that the U.S. no longer had serious military opposition to just trying to dominate the world. I didn't understand empire. I didn't understand that the drive of capitalism behind globalization was as exploitative as it was, etc. So I thought that, the 90s meant we were going to have global peace, etc. And things did quiet down for a while in the 90s until Bill Clinton, kind of kept quietly bombing Iraq. We didn't have much of an internet back then, so that news didn't get around as easily. And then, of course, Bill Clinton in Yugoslavia with the bombing, and then, of course, 9/11. But 9/11 was on a whole other level. It was like, we're going to have a century of war. was literally what the George Bush people were talking about. PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, basically was the George W. Bush cabinet, and they had already written papers on how they were going to use what they called, quote, full spectrum dominance to dominate space, the earth, like everything, militarily if needed. And they said in those documents that the process of change from, a relatively more tranquil Cold War, or no war era, would be opposed by, to just full-on militarization and rebuilding. Well, the name of the document was Rebuilding America's Defenses. So doing this remilitarization, they knew people would oppose it unless there was what they called absent a new Pearl Harbor type of event that would rally public opinion. Literally, that's 2 years before 9/11, and it's kind of just a hop, skip, and a jump up to 9/11, and all those people are in power, and boom, September 11th, 2001, Bush is in office for like 8 months, and that's what we get. Really, up to that point in 2001, people were just kind of thinking, wow, we have a really dumb president. And then that happened, and just everything changed. I remember going into New York City and being in Grand Central Station, and massive, like 30-foot American flags hanging from the ceiling. Maybe they were even bigger. Soldiers in camo with machine guns in the station. This was like previously unthinkable. I can't even tell you, if you were born particularly like after 1995, you may not really remember the pre-9/11 world. It was dramatically different. Actually, I was watching a movie a while back, not to get too off topic, but called The Parallax View from the 70s. It's a thriller with Warren Beatty. And there's a point in there that made my jaw drop where he, because it was just so different. He needs to fly on an airplane. He buys a ticket, and just you see him like going across the tarmac and like climbs up a set of stairs. It was just like a bus. It was like getting a ticket for a bus. Now it's like you need to have your genitals fondled to get on a plane. Very, very different world. 9/11 is what changed it. The Bush people, we were 20 years into neoliberalism at that point, if we want to count it officially as Reagan. They were starting some of the neoliberal push in the 70s. Really, the 80s was where it started. And then I would say that this was formally the second chapter of neoliberalism, in my opinion, was the War on Terror, because it was a just balls out assault on the existing order. And I have talked to people who say things like the U.S. was always fascist. There was a clear chilling effect on civil liberties. There was a clear effect on the tone of the national discourse. Literally everything became about terrorism. Do you know how often people talked about terrorism in the 90s? Like hardly ever. It wasn't a major topic of discussion. It wasn't even really a minor topic of discussion. It just didn't really come up, like kind of ever. You'd have like a terror event over there somewhere, somewhere else every few years, and it would make, Time magazine or something. But it just wasn't like repeated 49 times an hour on the TV. After 9/11, it was all people talked about, and people became kind of ludicrously afraid that, Al-Qaeda was going to blow up their mailbox out in like rural Idaho or something. That was precisely the effect they wanted. And in fact, I'll see if I can interject into this video here footage from the 2004 Republican National Convention. Somebody did a mashup of all the times that they mentioned terrorism. And it's like you never would have heard this before. Not remotely close. So the tone changed. Also, the Department of Homeland Security. Homeland Security was not a thing before 2001. People criticized it at the time, saying it sounded like, the Nazi fatherland or something. Yeah, it did. It was. Now, research that I did, because having your whole world that you thought you're going to grow up into, like turned on its head like this, I personally was like, what is going on? And I was very naive. I didn't really know back then. But I was old enough to start finding out. So I started looking at things. And it turns out that a lot of the George W. Bush people were recyclees from like the Bush 1 and Reagan administrations. And they had been drawing up since, the 80s or 70s, all these like continuity of government, emergency continuity police state type programs. There was one called Readiness Exercise 84. That was very similar to what they actually used in Katrina, where they corralled everybody into a stadium kind of a thing. But basically, this whole infrastructure of DHS didn't exist previously. But after 9/11, it was a way for them to consolidate all these police state powers, let alone the Patriot Act. All of the enhanced spying, which some of it may have been going on beforehand, but it became formally accepted. Judges were, now expected to like sign off on it. Looking at your library, if you're using a computer at a library, which was probably more common back then because not everybody had broadband. Actually, few people had broadband in the early 2000s. The FBI could come and look at your history without any real reason. So things dramatically changed. If you disagree with that, leave a comment. We can discuss. But honestly, and that's just the sort of political and legal side that I'm not even doing it really justice. And the idea of perpetual war as well was like, we're going to have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. And it was like the Bush administration at one point, I can't find the list anymore. They had a list of over 60 countries that they wanted to invade. And the Obama administration continued down the list. So we were now dealing with a scenario where it was like the U.S. is unopposed by a major superpower, and the U.S. is just going to start steamrolling any country that it feels like it could gain, material or geopolitical advantage by conquering. And that was the new American century, and we're just supposed to accept that. And it was like, what the fuck? Because it really, for most people, seemed to completely come out of the blue. So again, there was all that. There was the cultural effect. I mean, it was, like I said, terrorism became like a household word, and it became just the obsession, the topic of conversation. And I feel like, I care a lot about the arts and music and film, and I feel like it just completely sucked the air out of the room. There was just this constant tension, and I feel this was the real beginning of culturally the shift towards fascism, and the U.S. was already pretty polarized in the 90s. This deepened that so dramatically. But it was just laying bare the existing problems in society, but it was really, really aggravating them as well. You got the Tea Party coming out of this period, and then that led directly to Trump. So people who want to understand why we're at where we're at in 2020, yes, capitalism, absolutely, over the last few centuries, this is what happens. If you want to know the particulars of what is happening with the United States right now, I believe that the best place to start is 9/11. If you want to get a grip on the U.S.'s current slate of wars as compared to anything in the past, go back about 20 years to 9/11. And so that's what we're going to do today. As I was saying, I was against the Iraq War and the Afghan War just on principle. I didn't like war. I think you need a really good reason. I didn't think this was a really good reason. And then a couple of years later, I saw a video showing some of the details about 9/11, the scene of the crime, as it were. And it just, I walked away from that screening. I remember actually it was in 2004. So it was about 16 years ago this month. And I think since that day, I have not been the same person. I walked out of that. I was not somebody prone necessarily to believing conspiracies as a whole. I mean, I think there's some people who get into it. It's exciting. There's psychological reasons, whatever. I walked out of that, and I'd kind of ridiculed that in the past. I walked out of this thing going, there's literally no way. It's not possible for the official story of 9/11 to be remotely true, and the only people who could have done it had to have been on the inside. There's just literally no other explanation. We're going to get into that evidence in this video, as I mentioned, but anyway, that's the setup. If you trust S4A's opinions and my reasoning ability, if you followed me this far, follow me today. Like I said, I walked out of that video screening 16 years ago pretty much like unable to sleep for like the next few years. I was like, I need to find out what the fuck is happening. And, that I asked in the 2000s, I asked the libertarians because they were kind of the only people around to ask. I asked the liberals. Both of them gave me nothing. I mean, the left liberals and the rad libs. Both them and the libertarians gave me fucking nothing. Then Occupy happened, and I wound up kind of an anarchist for a few years, but I quickly sort of outgrew that. That was, of course, 2011, I think. Maybe it was 2010. I don't remember, actually, but I think it was 2011. And yeah, I mean, for about the last 5 years, I've been going in the direction of Marxism, Leninism, because I just realized anarchism sort of is a load of shit. Some okay ideas, no real way to follow through on them. So anyway, that's literally why I'm doing S4A is I just really wanted to get to the bottom of 9/11 and found out so much more, because every time I found out, another step of what do we do about this, it seemed to be like a bigger and bigger and bigger problem than I had previously estimated. And it does, I think, come down to capitalism and, the history. I mean, history up to this point is the history of class struggle. That really is the conclusion I sort of independently came to, and then realized, I had to, Marx was right all along. Hence, here we are, doing a show about socialism and communism. But 9/11 truth was not always a libertarian issue. I mean, they glom onto everything with their simplistic government did it, government bad kind of thing. That is not the interpretation that I take. It's, who is the government? It's they work for the corporations, they work for the bourgeoisie. Therefore, this was a right-wing coup to enhance corporate power for empire, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the libertarian, view on this is just plain dumb. I did a video on libertarianism just a few days ago. So if you want to know my thoughts about libertarianism, and they're blaming the government for everything when government is just one institution in a society ruled by the capitalist class, go check that out. It's titled Jojo No No. So, here we are. This is a sad and depressing topic, but that is my story, and I believe that the left really needs to catch up on this. We did what we could in the 2000s. There really wasn't social media then. There was MySpace and like Yahoo groups. We did what we could, but the left was really small. You kind of had a lot more liberals who hadn't been radicalized. You had Republicans, of course. You had libertarians. You had some Greens, and the Greens were good, generally speaking, on this issue. But there really wasn't much of a socialist left in those days. It was not vocal. There weren't many S4A type things out there, and the many other good shitposting pages that, are really spreading the word. So let's give it another try. 9/11 to me never gets stale. Literally, if 9/11 hadn't happened, I mean, you could argue there'd be some other event, but if an event like this had not happened, we would still be in a different national headspace right now, and the world would be in a different space because the U.S. wouldn't have been able to do what it did, and there would have been, I think, a lot more opposition. And I think that we get people like Trump and this sort of blind questing for change, and as well as scapegoating, as fascists do, vulnerable populations rather than blaming the capitalist class, because people know we need change. And there's a massive credibility gap of the existing order. That's why George W. Bush has been retired into a black hole and they don't really talk about him anymore. George W. Bush was president for 8 fucking years. Dick Cheney, has anybody seen him? Rumsfeld, I mean, he's old, but he's alive. Where are these people? Paul Wolfowitz, the whole Bush-Cheney gang, Feith, Pearl, Condoleezza Rice, on and on. That entire cadre was completely discredited. And then, of course, Obama came in, the savior, and really just kind of continued the same agenda, but the liberals didn't protest it. And that's sort of the last note is 2008. I did a lot of anti-war and 9/11 activism in the 2000s. When the election cycle started in 2007, it just flattened the momentum like a pancake. 9/11 Truth in 2006 was big. That was the year of the 5th anniversary. And by 2007, it was, I mean, it had been getting onto even like cable TV shows. It was getting big because we had a lot of evidence by then. In the beginning, there were just a few people talking about this. By 5 years in, there was a movement. I mean, and it was a movement. And yeah, there were infiltrators, there was COINTELPRO, there were flat out Nazis, I mean, which is common tactics to discredit. There was also a lot of sane and reasonable people in there. And unfortunately, both we were getting drowned out by 2007, 2008 by those plants. A good example is there was a group called Scholars for 9/11 Truth, which was experts, people with expertise in chemistry, architecture, engineering, saying 9/11 could not have happened the way that they said. It had to have been explosives, etc. And one of the heads of that was clearly a plant, Jim Fetzer, who broke off and founded another group that started putting out insane stuff, like lasers destroyed the towers and all this other stuff. There was the no planers who said that the planes were a hologram. These people were plants. There's no other way to say it. And it destroyed the movement along with the election coming in 2007. And everybody on the right started looking to Ron Paul and everybody on the left started looking to Obama. That's just the way that politics were at that point. And then the 2008 crash. People stopped talking about terrorism. I think that the ruling class sort of dusted their hands off and said, mission accomplished. We got to totally change the society using the trauma of 9/11 that they just kept pounding in day after day after day, using that trauma as a pretense to get society to accept radical changes in terms of the militarization and war policies of the country and surveillance. The whole police state was rolled out during that time under DHS. And then the economy crashed. And then people were like, whoa, I just lost, a third of my savings, or I lost my job, depending on your class position. But it was bad across the board. And people just stopped talking about terrorism. And we walked away and kind of nobody talked about 9/11 Truth again. So I guess that's where we need to pick it up, is the wars are still going on. Bush started 2. Obama added 5. Trump really hasn't added much except for kind of Yemen through funding. There might be other things we don't know about, but they weren't able to just keep steamrolling on the 60 countries list that the Bush administration under Secretary of State Colin Powell had wanted. But so, I mean, to some extent, it's losing momentum. Trump may actually be better than Biden for that stuff. Trump's horrible in a million ways. He may actually be better for other countries in terms of not, being invaded by the U.S. But basically, this order that was started, this whole New American Century project that had 9/11 as its foundational event and pretext. Like I said, if you want to understand the 21st century, as of right now, 9/11 is what you need to understand, and that's what we're going to do. So without any further ado, I'll come back and maybe have some more comments at the end we are going to look at a video called Loose Change. There were quite a few 9/11 documentaries produced. I think Loose Change is one of the clearest. They did 4 editions of this movie. The first, Loose Change, I'm not totally sure, to be honest, just on the subject, why they called it Loose Change. I mean, you could look at it as, let's let change loose. Not exactly sure, but I do like the title. Anyway, they did the first edition of Loose Change in 2005. That gained traction and popularity pretty quickly. There wasn't YouTube back then, so they were putting it on video.google.com and spreading it through DVDs and, torrents and other things that people could do. Then in 2006, I believe, they did Loose Change second edition, Loose LC2E, they were calling it. That was big, and that's the one that really blew up. It was called the first internet blockbuster, etc. And that really spread. They did a third edition called Loose Change Final Cut in late 2007. And then they did which I think both Loose Change second edition and Loose Change Final Cut are excellent caps of what was going on around that peak time of like 5 years in, 6 years in. We had so much evidence about what happened on 9/11, who was involved, etc. Not all the answers, but lots and lots of evidence. I mean, you just can't argue with it, in my opinion. There's just no way. I mean, there's no way you can look at this and not feel that your certainty about this event at least has been shaken a little bit, or completely. And actually, speaking of Loose Change Final Cut, I remember I was involved with an activist group. We did a screening of that movie, and I showed up a little bit late, and I remembered walking up the steps into the auditorium, and there was a guy in his 20s sitting outside the room where the screening was going on, and he had this look. He had his head in his hands, and he had this look on his face like he was just shattered. And I know that look because I got 9/11 facts for a while. I don't think I could do it anymore, but I'd need a little practice anyway. I got 9/11 facts down to where I could do a little one-man show of it. And I had this talk with a lot of people, and it was 50-50. Some people were just like, oh, you're nuts, blah, blah, blah. And then the other half of people, you could just see the look on their face of like, oh my God, this isn't bullshit. And the guy had that look exactly the way. So we'll see what you think. But there was a 4th edition of Loose Change called An American Coup in 2009. And we'll be drawing from all of them. I really recommend. I might even mirror them on Socialism for All. They're that important in my opinion. Like I said, there were others. I think Loose Change is probably the best overall. A lot of them have weird speculative stuff or whatever. Like I said, I think this is a good baseline. Also, I would be remiss not to mention, I mean, I mentioned libertarians. Of course, Alex Jones was active on this issue. I never liked Alex Jones. But if you only came to know Alex Jones in like the last 5 or 10 years, he wasn't always like that. I am not defending Alex Jones. I think he has had bad politics for a long time. Allegedly, I think his father was in the CIA. I mean, there have been accusations toward Alex Jones of being a plant like since the 90s, since forever. He espouses right-wing politics I don't agree with. That said, 9/11 is not exactly a left or right issue when it comes to the evidence itself. You can interpret it in different ways that could be more or less accurate. Jones obviously took the government is evil libertarian approach, but he did some sane presentations on 9/11 before he like completely, got activated by his handlers and went full Trump and everything else. But it is what it is. R.I.P. the few times that Alex Jones actually made sense way back in the day. Again, I never really liked him, but he used to not be 100% batshit. Let's just say that. Okay, so we're going to start here with a section on the World Trade Center. I have reordered the sections of Loose Change, and I have edited for time a little bit. If you want to see the original, there's a link to the original, but this is going to be long enough as it is. So this first section is specifically on the Twin Towers, Tower 1 and 2, World Trade Center 1, World Trade Center 2, North Tower, South Tower. Another building did fall, but that's covered later in the video. So we're going to do the Twin Towers first. Some notes that I'd like to point out for you going in. There are a number of sections within this. There's a section on comparable skyscrapers built around the same time, same type of construction, which burned for many hours, had much bigger fires, and did not collapse. The fires in the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, were relatively cool. It was red and orange fire, lots of smoke, which makes sense. These were fireproofed office buildings that were up to code, and just office contents don't burn that hot, generally speaking. There was jet fuel, which was kerosene, largely burned off in the initial fireball. Some of it did, of course, soak into the building and burned there. But again, the fires were not that hot. Then we see explosive collapse. This was not, and it'll be discussed in the video, the kind of structural failure you typically see like this is not through the path of greatest resistance. The towers collapsed straight down and in fact exploded outwards symmetrically. That's a lot of force which is unaccounted for by just a gravitational collapse. In other words, you had to have extra force pushing steel beams and things outwards, up in some cases, and outwards from the building as it fell straight down onto itself. The towers were built to withstand the largest plane at that time in the 70s, which was a Boeing 707, which is in fact larger in some ways. It has 4 engines instead of 2 than the planes which actually hit it, traveling at 600 miles per hour. The planes that hit the towers were traveling around 450 miles per hour. So it was built to withstand a larger plane. And as one of the structural engineers and project managers explains in this video, the outside of the Twin Towers, in addition to the core structural beams, is like very redundant, like mosquito netting, where you could poke a pencil through and it's probably going to go right through without affecting the rest of it. That is very much the way that the skin of the Twin Towers was built. And that's what you see, actually, for the most part. After the plane hits on each of the towers, there's a plane that hit each of them, you see a hole where it hit, not massive warping around. And then about an hour later, boom, the entire building blows up. Actually, on that note of explosions, many eyewitnesses that you will see here reported a variety of secondary explosions. Some people described it like the finale of the 4th of July. In other words, they said like somebody lit off a string of firecrackers, pop, 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 pop. That's exactly what you hear at a controlled demolition, because they're blowing all the joints and hinges of the structural beams, and then the whole thing collapses. That's pretty much what happened here. So there are reports of people seeing and hearing flashes and that kind of crackling explosion around the building. Another interesting thing about the secondary explosions, many reports pointed to an explosion, a subterranean explosion, that was around the time of the first plane hitting. Specifically bombs going off in the lobby and elevators. So this is a whole section of the video. I'll let you watch it because they can tell it a lot better than I can. But fireballs in the lobby, the bottom floor, subway. Also, something to note are the dust clouds. There's a section on this. The buildings were not, they didn't just crack and fall over, which is, like I mentioned, typical for a gravitational collapse. It's actually hard to get the building to come straight down because you're trying to drop it through a structure that is built not to fall. what we get are dust clouds. The building was completely pulverized. Now, would you think if it collapsed due to gravity, you get some pulverization? Sure. The entire building? Absolutely not. And I say the entire building except for the steel beams, the structural beams that were cut neatly into like 3-foot sections. That's what we saw. Actually, if you look at the remnants, that's what was left. So we're looking at this like a crime or like an experiment and saying what accounts for this. You know, a plane, jet fuel, and then kaboom. It's just not possible that it came from the jet. So the pulverized buildings, there is footage, I don't believe it's in here unless it's later on in the video, where one of the firemen is saying like the biggest thing that he even saw that was recognizable in the wreckage was a piece of a telephone keypad, and it was about 2 inches big. So the buildings were pulverized. How? Where did all that energy come from? It takes a lot of energy to pulverize a desk or a computer. Was it just the building falling? Well, you take a closer look and see. Also, on the subject of the dust cloud, toxic chemicals, including basically a building and a half worth of asbestos sprayed steel. This was going to cost $1 billion to remove, and it just wound up in the air and water. Along those lines, the EPA at the time they knew that the air was not safe to breathe, but people were told just to go back to work. Sound familiar? It's happening right now. This has been going on for decades. So anyway, I think the last note that I would make going into this is look for the guy, the eyewitness. The fellow kids meme was not around in 2001, but the guy's like, and then I witnessed the second building collapse, mostly due to structural failure. And he's wearing like jeans and a t-shirt and a baseball hat. You know, hello, my fellow witnesses. So you have planted witnesses. It looks like you have obvious evidence of explosives. Anyway, I'll just let you watch. There's actually going to be an additional section about the World Trade Center later on when we do Building 7, but this is the Twin Towers. Here we go.
(9:59), New York City, New York. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, 110 stories tall, collapses to the ground in approximately 10 seconds. 29 minutes later, the North Tower follows suit, also collapsing in approximately 10 seconds. Later that evening, at 5:20, World Trade Center Building 7, 47 stories tall, collapses to the ground in under 7 seconds. The official explanation is that falling debris from the North Tower created a series of fires inside the building. If this is true, it would be the third steel-frame skyscraper in history to completely collapse because of damage and fire. The first two would be the Twin Towers. February 23rd, 1991. One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story skyscraper in Philadelphia, burned for 18 hours across 8 floors. It is later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004. A 56-story skyscraper in Caracas, Venezuela, built in 1976, burned for over 17 hours and spread across 26 floors. It did not collapse. February 13th, 1975. A 3-alarm fire broke out between the 9th and 14th floors of the North Tower.
No one died. The building was unoccupied. The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. There should have been fire stops to prevent it from spreading, but there weren't. The fire spread to 6 other floors. Even without a sprinkling system, fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
The fire is so intense it leads to the installation of sprinkler systems, which would come in handy on May 19th, 1975, when 7 fires strike the complex. The South Tower had garbage fires dispersed between the 25th and 36th floor, and the North Tower had a fire on the 11th floor. 6 of the fires were minor, but the 7th on the 32nd floor of the South Tower caused heavy damage. Guess what? They did not collapse. September 11th, 2001. 2 110-story skyscrapers, completed in 1973, burned for 56 minutes over 8 floors and 103 minutes over 5 floors, respectively, before collapsing completely to the ground. Some argue that this was due to the construction of the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers were composed of 200,000 tons of steel and 425,000 cubic yards of concrete. The core of each tower was a rectangular pillar 87 by 133 feet, comprised of 47 steel box columns ranging from 36 by 16 to 52 by 22 inches. The North Tower was completed in 1970, standing at 1,368 feet tall, and the South Tower was completed in 1973, reaching 1,362 feet tall, making them the tallest buildings in the world at the time. They were designed to withstand multiple impacts from a Boeing 707, the largest aircraft at its time. An analysis, released in 1964, claims that the buildings were investigated and found to be safe in an assumed collision with a 707 traveling at 600 miles per hour. Such collision would result in only local damage which could not cause collapse or substantial damage to the building. A 707 has 4 engines instead of 2, and its cruise speed is 607 miles per hour. The Boeing 767s that struck the North and South Tower were traveling at 440 and 540 miles per hour, respectively.
Breaking news on WCBS 880, right here, right now. I believe if we can get in touch with him, we have a witness who saw what happened at the World Trade Center.
This apparently was a commuter plane that smashed into it with such force that the windows of the Pick-a-Bagel smashed with a big bang. Everybody was very frightened.
Did you manage to see what kind of plane it was?
No, I couldn't tell. It was a smaller plane. It looked like a smaller plane, but I couldn't tell. I'm not really sure.
A medium-sized body plane with engines on both sides. Almost like a gray-black color in nature on the plane.
I would say it wasn't a huge jet, but it was a plane that sounded like it was a fighter jet overhead.
I work right next door at 74 Trinity Place. We heard the first one come in. I didn't know what it was. It sounded like a missile.
Oh, my God, Ed, another plane just hit the World Trade Center. Another plane. It was a medium-sized plane. Unbelievable.
It would appear, Jim, as if there's more smoke coming from the ground
and we used to have another, things have fallen to the ground and are burning. And we have...
One gentleman told me he was on the 65th floor standing next to an elevator when the elevator exploded and knocked him out of his shoes. Another woman said that she was working on the 49th floor. She's seen people in the stairwells with burns, broken arms. People are passing out of the stairwells from the heat. She says there's a lot of heat and smoke. It's a horrible scene here. I'm live at Broadway and Fulton. Allison Keyes, WCBS 880 News.
All right, thank you, Allison.
Basically, there's people running around down the street. All the glass panes that are on the bottom part of the World Trade Center are all blown out. When I first heard it and ran over to the window, it looked like there was fire on the bottom floor.
Well, they're ahead there. And all of this, the world...
Oh, wait. Oh, my God. Oh, my God, the building fell. Are you there? The building just fell.
You said it sounded like the 4th of July. You heard a big explosion before the building fell?
I saw it as it was happening, and it sounded as if you had 100 of those little black cat firecrackers and you lit them all off at once. That's what it sounded like. It sounded like the finale of the 4th of July over the East River.
Oh my We just witnessed some kind of secondary follow-up explosion.
10 o'clock Eastern Time this morning, just collapsing on itself. We have no idea what caused this.
Almost looks like one of those planned implosions.
As if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself and it is not there anymore.
If you wish to bring anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
Right now, police have to determine is whether that explosion was caused from the initial impact of the plane or whether it was something that was exploded on the ground. Generally speaking, for a building to collapse in on itself like that, it would seem to indicate that there could have been an explosion, a bomb planted on the ground that would make the building collapse within itself.
By that evening, eyewitnesses and experts alike were rushing to defend the official narrative of events, claiming that raging jet fuel fires melted the steel inside the Twin Towers.
I saw this plane come out of nowhere and just ream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
When one of those airplanes crashed into one of the towers, it was the equivalent of a 6-point earthquake.
Marlene Davis is the Dean of Architecture at the University of Tennessee. She calls the 110-story tall twin tower tube structures. That means there are no internal columns holding it up.
You know, when we saw this yesterday, people said, oh my goodness, there was a bomb on there. There must have been a bomb that collapsed.
Must have been a bomb below.
Right, that finished the job. Well, it turns out we heard from experts who said that, you know what, the fire on those floors, probably 1,500 degrees. Steel can only withstand so much because the steel structure that holds the building up was on the outside, and essentially the building started to melt and it gave way and it toppled.
Engineers suspect the temperatures inside the crash areas could have quickly reached well over 1,000 degrees, perhaps approaching 2,000 degrees, beyond the melting point of any steel.
They were not designed, perhaps, to take a direct strike from something the size of a 737 or an Airbus, perhaps fully loaded with fuel. Steel will melt.
Physics professor and explosives expert Van Romero.
Even if there was no secondary explosives in the building, hitting the having the airplane hit the building where it did, a large amount of weight above the damaged location, that damaged location being further damaged by the fire, that structure could no longer support the weight above it, and the collapse ensues.
Numerous individuals, including some of the architects themselves, would claim that plane crashes were never taken into consideration and that the building was doomed to failure.
Hyman Brown was the project engineer on the Twin Towers, the man on the ground in charge of making sure the buildings were built right, the way it was designed.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
Each tower was built around a central core. That core kept the building up, supporting the tower's so-called dead weight. But when steel melts, according to Brown, like dominoes, it falls. Brown says the towers were built to withstand 200-mile-an-hour hurricanes, the 100-year storm, the worst nature could dish out. But he says an airplane crash never entered anyone's mind.
However, that's not entirely true.
Yet the impact of the planes alone did not cause that failure. In fact, tall building designers try to anticipate air accidents. Marc Loiseau is president of a company called Controlled Demolition.
When this structure was designed, it was designed, to the best of my understanding, to take the impact of what was then the state-of-the-art airplane being used in our country, the Boeing 707.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting.
John Skilling, the World Trade Center's head structural engineer, told the Seattle Times after the 1993 bombing that if a plane struck the building, there would be a horrendous fire, but the building structure would still be there. On August 21, 2002, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, commenced their investigation. NIST is a government agency that reports back to the United States Department of Commerce, headed at that point by Donald Evans and later replaced by Carlos Gutierrez, both Bush cabinet appointees. As part of their investigation, NIST contracted Underwriters Laboratories to recreate floor models from the Twin Towers for the purpose of fire resistance tests.
We heard about it in the news. We heard about it right away that the floors didn't collapse. Okay, so they tested these huge models. They're models, but they're huge. I mean, one model was essentially the same size and exactly the same as one of the types of floor sections used. And they tested it according to ASTM E119. They exposed it to much longer fire and higher temperatures than we know were present in the World Trade Center. So right away there was a problem, and that's August of 2004.
The final report was released on October 26, 2005, producing over 10,000 pages. It will not explain the actual collapse of the buildings. They only claim to get to collapse initiation and state flatly that it led to global collapse. The report, admittedly, does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable.
We were charged with finding out the cause of the collapse, and we found what happened. I think we've scientifically demonstrated what was required to initiate the collapse. Once the collapse initiated, the video evidence is rather clear. It was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate that, what is clear from the videos.
NIST concludes that they found no evidence suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition. Where would people get an idea like that? 1. Except for material that was blown outwards, the Twin Towers collapsed into their own footprint symmetrically at nearly free-fall speeds. Newton's laws of motion determine how long it takes an object to travel a certain distance in complete freefall. In a controlled environment, an object dropped from the roof of either twin tower would reach the ground in 9.2 seconds. The 9/11 Commission report will state, at 9:58, the South Tower collapsed in 10 seconds. Even NIST says the tops of the buildings came down essentially in free fall. Judge for yourself.
And our conclusion is that the building should not have fallen that rapidly if indeed fire caused the collapse. And so, in fact, there's one mechanical engineer, Gordon Ross, in the Journal of 911 Studies, who's done a thorough analysis based on conservation of momentum.
If the official story was correct, then the heating that was supposed to cause the failure would have been a much slower event, and it would have been an asymmetric event. For the tower to collapse straight down onto itself flies in the face of what we know about steel and how steel behaves. When we have a failure in one area, then the failures tend to continue within that area, and you'd see an asymmetric collapse, possibly the upper section falling off as it twisting away from the tower and falling off. But it's very unusual to see the upper section falling straight through the path of the greatest resistance, which was straight down through the middle of the tower. It just does not add up.
2. Molten metal exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit was discovered in the rubble of Ground Zero, underneath the Twin Towers and Building 7. Even with heavy rain on September 14th and 21st, a constant stream of fire retardants and water, described as creating a giant lake, these fires would not be extinguished until December 13th, 2001, making it the longest burning structural fire in history. Was the jet fuel responsible? Dr. Frank Gale, who was working with NIST, claimed in 2005. Your gut reaction would be that the jet fuel melted the steel. Indeed, it did not. The steel did not melt.
The temperatures that we know existed within the collapse, within the debris pile, are physically impossible from an atmospheric jet fuel fire. Cannot be done.
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers.
I am too.
And
Please tell me about it. Have you seen it?
Well, not personally, but eyewitnesses there found huge pools of molten steel beneath the towers, and some scientists don't think that the collapse of the building could have melted all that steel.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it. I was on the site, I was on the steel yards, so I don't know that that's so.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano. Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
However, they do hit hot spots occasionally, and everything stops.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
I don't know that that's so.
There's video of it.
Melted around 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. I think it's probably pretty difficult to get that kind of temperatures in a fire.
Well, NASA pictures, thermal images showed those sorts of temperatures in the basement.
Could you send them to me?
Okay. My name is Mark, and I'm the individual who was questioning Dr. Gross, and he asked me to email to him those thermal images. When I approached him after his talk to get his email address for that purpose, he refused to provide it to me. I think this is important because it reveals the attitude of the NIST investigators, which is one of willful ignorance of what really happened on 9/11.
As well as the molten metal in the debris, it was also observed prior to the South Tower's collapse. Also, a minute and 20 seconds before collapse, large amounts of white smoke begin pouring from the base of the South Tower. Three, the concrete, and in fact, virtually everything except the metal inside the Twin Towers was pulverized as the building collapsed. This pulverized material created pyroclastic dust clouds that raced down city streets, coating lower Manhattan in a fine dust. Pyroclastic clouds generally occur during two events: volcanic eruptions and controlled demolitions. Four, steel beams weighing up to 200,000 pounds were thrown laterally up to 500 feet. A cross-section from the World Trade Center weighing approximately 300 tons was embedded in the southeastern corner of the American Express building. This piece would have had to travel at least 390 feet, maintaining enough kinetic energy to embed itself in the corner of the building.
What we should have seen in the debris pile was a pyramidal shape. If it had been a gravity-driven collapse, we would have seen a roughly pyramidal shape or a conic shape. What we actually did see was a massive ejection of dust and debris and large sections of steel from well away from the towers, tens of meters away from the towers. That's hard to see a reason for that within a gravity-driven collapse.
5. Firefighters and eyewitnesses reported a series of explosions before and during the collapses.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
Secondary explosion on Tower 2.
Some sort of explosive device.
We're obviously having a bit of trouble right now maintaining our location because we just heard one more explosion
There was another major explosion.
Do you know anything about those extra explosions we heard?
No, I do not.
Were they car bombs?
I have no idea, ma'am.
The street shook, and I heard like an explosion.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. They were taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt. Not clear now is why this explosion took place. When there was some sort of collapse or explosion.
From street level, as though it had exploded up, a giant rolling ball of flame, and the firefighters screamed, "Run!"
There was this blast of warm air. It wasn't hot. It was warm. And it picked me up and threw me up against the wall of the building.
You were picked up off the ground.
Physically picked up off the ground.
I remember an explosion. At that point, I got knocked out. I don't remember anything. Then I got up, and I looked out the window because the windows exploded, and the street below caved in. And at that point, there was like fireballs coming up.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
About 15 minutes after they made their entry, we heard a boom. I don't know if that was the infrastructure that was going or another explosion.
Again, there has been a second explosion.
John, just seconds ago there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
All of a sudden I heard rumbling, and we all started running away from it. The glass blew out and threw me onto the sidewalk, and I couldn't see for 20 seconds.
It was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on the mezzanine level there. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
So I was real lucky. I don't know what happened to the people behind me when that blast occurred.
And was actually on the 78th floor of the second tower and was evacuating the tower and experienced all these explosions and made his way back down.
We presume because of the initial explosion there may have been secondary explosions as well that were detonated in the building by these terrorists.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandeliers shook, and again black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Eyewitnesses also reported that explosions had taken place in lower levels of both the North and South Tower.
They were having coffee in the World Trade Center when the first plane struck.
And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb, and it was just pounding, boom, 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 and I literally thought the subway had exploded. And
the ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
Just get out of the tunnel and the blue. The subway tunnel? Yeah.
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
And when I got up to the concourse level, it was just like gunfire, and then just three big explosions.
And even the turnstile was burnt and was sticking up, and they just told us to run.
I heard the first explosion, and the elevator blew up.
And as we were coming out, we passed the lobby. There was no lobby. So I believe the bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds then the first plane hit.
Firefighter John Schroeder arrived in the lobby of the North Tower shortly after the first plane struck.
So we're standing there in the lobby, we're getting all together. All of a sudden, we hear... I look down to my right, and the elevators exploded, something out of like a Bruce Willis Die Hard movie. People just come running out of the elevators, on fire, fireball. I mean, it was like, what is going on here? Something's up here. I mean, the plane's up there, now there's fire down here. People run around, all on fire. This is crazy. So we were heading up to the 24th floor of the stairwell, and all of a sudden we heard, Mayday, Mayday, second plane, second plane. Swift, we're looking at each other like, come on, second plane, there's no way there's a second plane. Within seconds, our building got rocked. we got bounced around in the stairwell like pinballs, man. And we just said, you know what? Time to go. We got down to the lobby, and everything was blown out, exploded. Everything was... And we were the only ones in the lobby now. We're going, wait a second here. Where is everybody? Because the building was coming down the outside. They moved the command post to World Trade Center, too. So now we're like, we didn't get no... Where is everybody? We were in the lobby. It looks like everything was exploded. Everything was gone. We're like, what is going on here? We didn't know. We were like, this is crazy. But for every window in the lobby to be exploded, I mean, them windows were like as thick as forget it. They were 2-3-inch glasses. You know, come on. They exploded out of the lobby. You know, something. It wasn't from the jet fuel. No way. The elevators exploded. They were down from the lobby. The lobby was over here. That should never have happened. Something would happen there, and that wasn't. We came down. It looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. There was no fire. It just looked like a bomb went off.
So, how was the largest and most puzzling architectural failure in history treated? The steel from the World Trade Center was mostly shipped overseas, eliminating any possibility of independent investigations. New York City's Department of Design and Construction contracted 4 companies for debris removal. Each was assigned a specific zone and controlled and monitored by a 3-person team. The operation was so controlled that in November, each dump truck used for removal of debris was fitted with a GPS locator. One driver took an extended lunch break and was dismissed from the job. By April 2002, over 185,000 tons of debris had been removed from Ground Zero. FEMA's Building Performance Assessment Team was not even granted access to Ground Zero. They were granted a tour of the site in early October, but were forbidden from collecting samples or examining blueprints. Out of hundreds of thousands of pieces of steel, 150 were preserved at Fresh Kills landfill, from where FEMA conducted its investigation. When the Twin Towers came down, they released over 500 tons of pulverized asbestos into Lower Manhattan, along with lead, barium, mercury, chromium, copper, and several other toxic chemicals. 425,000 cubic yards of concrete is pulverized. 600,000 square feet of glass is turned into dust. During the World Trade Center's construction, spray-on fireproofing comprised of concrete and asbestos was placed on the core columns. When asbestos was outlawed in 1971, they ceased this procedure at the 64th floor of the South Tower. The Port Authority eventually realized that the asbestos presented a problem, and demolition was not an option. In 1989, the Port Authority estimated the removal of asbestos from both the World Trade Center and LaGuardia Airport would have cost up to $1 billion. By 2001, the cost for the World Trade Center buildings alone would have met or exceeded $1 billion. This money would sadly not be needed. Although it was clear that the air was not safe to breathe, the public was urged to return to Lower Manhattan. Wall Street opened back up on September 17th, and children were allowed to go back to school. Firefighters, police, and rescue workers were allowed to toil in lethal conditions using paper masks from Home Depot, while government officials walked around in hazmat suits.
My name's John Field. I was hurt at Ground Zero during the cleanup. Wow, I was only there for 5 days before I was horribly injured, and I mean horribly injured. Leading up to that day, every day I was there, I complained that it was an unsafe workplace. Someone's going to get hurt. It just happened to be me. But I let everybody know that someone would get hurt. I was there for 5.5 days. Nobody told me to wear a mask once. Nobody gave a shit when that piece of steel altered my life. But like the thousands that are suffering and sick, I didn't roll over and play dead. And I know human life takes a backseat to the almighty dollar, and that's what makes this country roll and run, is the almighty dollar. But you guys somewhere along the line lost your credibility with me.
The Environmental Protection Agency, under direct orders from the White House, told New Yorkers that the air was safe to breathe. The administrator at the time, Christine Whitman, issued an internal memo on September 12th, declaring that all statements to the media should be cleared through the National Security Council before they are released.
So what happened? The White House changed EPA press releases to add reassuring statements and delete cautionary ones. September 13th, the EPA draft release, never released to the public, says EPA testing terrorized sites for environmental hazards. The White House changes that to EPA reassures public about environmental hazards. September 16th, the EPA draft says recent samples of dust on Water Street show higher levels of asbestos. The White House version, new samples confirm ambient air quality meets OSHA standards and is not a cause for public concern. And the White House leaves out entirely this warning, that air samples raise concerns for cleanup workers and office workers near Water Street. Why all these changes? We were told that a desire to reopen Wall Street and national security concerns were the reasons for changing the press releases.
Okay, so there you go. While I think that is good footage from Loose Change Final Cut, the Loose Change Second Edition, again, Final Cut is the third edition, had additional footage that I'm not really sure why they took it out of the Final Cut, although it was, long as it is, I guess. They thought they were trimming it, but I think this is important footage. So here is a bit of supplementary footage from Loose Change Second Edition about the Twin Towers.
Ginny Carr was attending a business meeting on the 36th floor of One Liberty Plaza, across the street from the World Trade Center, and caught the entire first attack on tape. A second explosion can be heard 9 seconds after the crash.
It sounds like something crashed.
So what happened in the North Tower? Ask Willie Rodriguez. Willie, a janitor who worked in the World Trade Center for 20 years, was in sub-level 1 when the North Tower was hit.
And all of a sudden we hear boom! I thought it was a generator that blew up on the basement. And I said to myself, oh my God, I think it's a generator. And I was going to verbalize it. When I finished saying that in my mind, I hear boom! Right on the top, pretty far away. So it was a difference between coming from the basement and coming from the top. And that's, everybody started screaming. And a person comes running into the office saying, explosion, explosion, explosion. He got his hand extended and all the skin was pulled from his under his arm, all the way to the top of the fingertips, and it was hanging on both arms. Hanging and hanging. And then I look at his face and he was missing parts on his face. And I said, what happened? What happened? And he said, the elevators, the elevators. There were many explosions, and when I actually talk about those explosions, they said that, well, there were so many kitchens in the building, and they have probably those gas canisters. And I say, I don't believe that, because the building was a Class A building. They have very strict guidelines of what you can put in a kitchen, and I really doubt it was gas. So there was a lot of misconceptions of what happened that day in terms of the explosions. But up to date, I haven't received an actual explanation about the different explosions that I heard on the upper floors and not all the way to the top.
The windows in the lobby of the North Tower were blown out, and marble panels were blown off of the walls. This was brushed off as damage from a raging fireball that went barreling down the elevator shafts. On 9/11, New York City lost 343 firefighters at the World Trade Center. Since they were the ones inside the towers before and as they collapsed, I'd say they've got a pretty good grasp on what happened. So what does the FDNY think? First, we had this interview from the Naudet Brothers documentary.
It was like the first thing there was nobody there. Where the fuck? What do we do? We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least two blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running. Just ran up West Street. And then you just sort of this cloud of shit chasing you down.
Couldn't outrun it.
Couldn't outrun it.
In these interviews, Numerous members of Engine 7 described explosions preceding the collapses, not to mention the damage to the lobby of the North Tower.
I heard a loud boom. And my first thing, I was right at the desk there on the left-hand side when you come into Tower 1. And I walked out, I didn't go out. I walked to where all the doorway was, the glass were broken, and I looked out, and I seen in the building across the street, I seen the shadow coming, I seen just the shadow in the building across the street coming down.
I wasn't expecting to see the damage that I saw in the lobby and the people, the bodies, the burnt people, the injured people. I really wasn't prepared for that.
The lobby is about 6 stories high, and the lobby looked as though a bomb had exploded there. All the glass was taken out. There were 10-foot by 10-foot marble panels that were once walls. They were loose from the wall of the Trade Center.
I went around by the freight elevator, and I could see it was just blown. It was just a giant shaft. And at that time, we heard a huge explosion. And we immediately dove for the stairs. Get back into the stairs. Let's get back into the stairs, because I had seen what happened in the lobby with the elevator being blown out. I said, if there's another explosion. What I feared, I never in a million years feared those buildings coming down. Never. I did fear secondary explosion, or possibly a second plane.
For more than a year, the Port Authority blocked the release of a tape of firefighters' transmissions from the World Trade Center on 9/11. In November 2002, the tape was finally released to the New York Times and other news outlets. Why did it take so long to get the tape released?
I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. 7-8. We just had another explosion.
Warren Street because of the secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion.
And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013.
Has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 1K? I've got 5 patients.
Chief Palmer had reached the fire on the 78th floor of the South Tower and devised a plan to put it out.
We got 2 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Where you know that? 78th floor, numerous 1045 call horns.
If the 78th floor was a raging inferno like the government would have us believe, then Palmer wouldn't have gotten as far as he did, and certainly wouldn't have been able to put it out. On August 12, 2005, an additional 15 hours of radio transmissions and transcripts of interviews with firefighters was finally released to the public. Firefighters described 2 events consistent with a controlled demolition: bright flashes from inside the building and a number of crackling sounds before the buildings collapsed. Do you still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 and here. You're probably asking, if there were bombs in the building, how would they get in there without anyone noticing? Daria Cord, a guard in the North Tower, told Newsday that security detail was working 12-hour shifts for 2 weeks before 9/11. But on Thursday the 6th, bomb-sniffing dogs were abruptly removed from the building. So who authorized all this? President Bush's brother, Marvin, was board of directors at Securicom from 1993 until fiscal year 2000. Securicom, now known as Stratosec, is an electronic security company backed by Kuwait American Corporation, which provided security for United Airlines, Dulles International Airport, and from the early 1990s up to the day of 9/11, the World Trade Center. Marvin is also the former director at HCC Insurance Holdings, which insured parts of the World Trade Center on 9/11. More information on this was supposed to be disclosed and never was. To date, the SEC has not revealed what they have learned.
Okay, so next, let's talk about Building 7. World Trade Center 7 was part of the World Trade Center complex. It was not struck by a plane, and it was hit by some debris. You'll see the condition of it. It had some small fires on some of the floors, and then abruptly around 5:30 p.m., it collapsed into its own footprint. As you will see in this footage, Building 7 was home to offices of the Department of Defense, Securities and Exchange Commission, IRS. It was a large CIA station, probably the second biggest CIA headquarters outside of Virginia. This largest Secret Service field office in the country outside of Washington again. And it was the home of Rudy Giuliani's Office of Emergency Services or something like that. Very secure building is the point. Very secure building. If someone were to rig it with explosives, that's an inside job. Sorry. With those offices in the building, there's no way somebody else could have gotten in there. You'll see. Small fires. There was also a premature announcement of the collapse on the BBC, and I believe also CNN. Like 20 minutes before it collapses, they announced that it had collapsed. Interesting. Again, reports of explosions inside the building. Also, squib-type puffs like we saw with the Twin Towers along the sides of it. Exactly what you would see in a controlled demolition. The same pyroclastic cloud of dust and debris that we see either in a volcano or a controlled demolition of a building. This was not even mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. David Ray Griffin is an author who did a great book, actually 2 books. The first one was The New Pearl Harbor, and then the second one was the 9/11 Commission report, Omissions and Distortions. He also worked as a script consultant on Loose Change Final Cut. 9/11 Commission report didn't even mention Building 7. And they're going to mention in here a NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology report that took forever to come out that they were doing on Building 7. Eventually, I believe that was published in 2008. Unfortunately, that late, close to 2010, the 9/11 Truth Movement had kind of petered out. However, one of the organizations that was founded later on in the game, I think in probably 08 or 07, was Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. I believe they're still going along with the Journal of 9/11 Studies. They did do a response to the NIST report. So anyway, I mean, it's just more lies and more lies and more omissions. But here we go. Let's watch the footage on a building you maybe have never heard of before.
I want to tell you that we are getting word from New York right now that another building has collapsed. I understand that this is a 47-story building.
It's Building 7 of the World Trade Center, we understand, has collapsed in New York, and there you saw a video of it. Now, whether we don't even know whether this was something that was engineered for safety reasons or it just happened.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
In 1984, construction began on World Trade Center Building 7, a 47-story office building, 570 feet tall, and 300 feet away from the North Tower. It opened to the public in 1987 and housed offices for Department of Defense, Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. Building 7 was considered the Central Intelligence Agency's largest station outside of Washington, D.C., and was also the Secret Service's biggest field office. Numerous cases would be closed due to its destruction. On June 8, 1999, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management Command Center on the 23rd floor is opened.
The command center on the 23rd floor is bulletproof and bomb-resistant, with its own air supply and generators. It's linked to city airports, the Coast Guard, and the Pentagon. Computers will soon have detailed blueprints of every major building in New York City, as well as evacuation routes. Hurricanes and heat waves would be handled here, as well as terrorist attacks. Though New York officials say their facility is not impenetrable, they're confident it could handle even the worst crisis imaginable. Deborah Fayerick for CNN, New York.
The 50,000 square foot center has reinforced, bulletproof, and bomb-resistant walls, its own air supply and water tank, beds and showers, and 3 backup generators. It has countless monitors which oversee police and fire department responses, and it is staffed around the clock. Hours before the first plane would strike the World Trade Center, Building 7's alarm system would be placed on test status at 6:47 a.m. for a scheduled period of 8 hours. This normally occurs during maintenance, and any fire alarms from the building are disregarded. After the second plane strikes the South Tower, the building's power is shut off and its tenants are evacuated. The major fires in World Trade Center 7 were as follows. On the east face, between floors 11 and 12. On the north face, on floors 7 and 12. On the west face, between floors 29 and 30. Smoke obscures the entire south face of the building. By 3 p.m., Chief Daniel Nigro of the FDNY had set up a collapse zone around Building 7. After 4 p.m., news outlets began reporting that the building had collapsed.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7, in the World Trade Center complex is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
We've got some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed. Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing, and indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani.
Jane, I think many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan. Perhaps we can rejoin her and follow that up later.
Where did CNN and BBC get their information, especially considering the building was still standing directly behind their reporters? The collapse of the building at 5:20 p.m. would cause speculation as to how it fell. The collapse of the main structure takes place in approximately 6.5 seconds, and the building falls symmetrically into its own footprint, barely damaging the surrounding structures. It will create a pyroclastic cloud that mushrooms down surrounding streets. Initially, it is assumed that the building's diesel tank may have been responsible for the collapse. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's report in 2002 will state that the specifics of the fires in WTC7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time.
FEMA does analyze the collapse of Building 7, but then they say our best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. This needs further investigation, and I certainly agree with them on that. Then NIST has handed the ball. It's kind of a hot potato. Okay, NIST, you explain the collapse of World Trade Center 7, this rapid, straight-down collapse of this 47-story skyscraper.
Sadly, by this time, virtually all structural steel from Ground Zero had been recycled, and no steel was recovered from Building 7 for investigation. As of this date, NIST is still working on their final report.
Well, NIST decoupled the study of the collapse of Building 7 from the analysis of the collapse of the towers. So now it's sitting over here. The report on the collapse of Building 7 from NIST is long overdue. We're still waiting for it, hoping they have an explanation.
We are looking at it. There's actually a very good write-up recently from Controlled Demolition Experts, which you probably ought to read. We haven't finished the investigation yet, so I'm not at liberty to talk about any intermediate findings.
The collapse is assumed to be caused by a combination of fire and structural damage. Did any other surrounding buildings suffer a complete collapse at near freefall speed? Building 3, a 22-story building directly below the Twin Towers, was split in half by the South Tower's collapse. Although the building was severely crushed by falling debris, the structure remained standing. Building 4, a 9-story building east of the South Tower, was almost completely destroyed. The remaining structure did not collapse. Building 5, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, suffered from severe fires and structural damage. Building 6, an 8-story building between the North Tower and Building 7, suffered a giant gouge in its roof and severe fires. Neither Building 5 or 6 suffered global collapse. Neither did the Deutsche Bank building, which stands to this day and is currently being demolished beam by beam. Neither did the Millennium Hotel across the street. Building 7 burns over a number of floors and suffers structural damage to its south face before collapsing completely to the ground. Did anything occur inside the building that might cause a collapse?
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. And I turned to Hesh. I said, this is it. We're dead. We're not going to make it out of here.
And we have Frank Uciardo back on the phone with us, Brenda, with some New York City officials. Frank, go ahead.
That's right. I'm standing here right now just off Broadway by City Hall with Michael Hess, who is the city's corporation counsel. Mr. Hess, you were trapped in, I believe, 7 World Trade Center. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I was. I was up in the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor, and when all the power went out in the building, another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor where there was an explosion, and we've been trapped on the 8th floor with smoke, thick smoke all around us for about an hour and a half. But the New York Fire Department, as terrific as they are, just came and got us out.
Their experience is mentioned by NIST's interim report on Building 7. However, the authors claim it is the collapse of the North Tower. The glass on the ground floor was not even blown out. Would debris and smoke rushing up the stairway be described as an explosion? So, we have a 47-story steel-framed skyscraper, which housed various government agencies and numerous important documents, damaged less than the other World Trade Center buildings. At 5:20 p.m., all structural elements inside Building 7 simultaneously fail, and it collapses symmetrically, imploding into a pile of rubble. This building had 81 columns, 24 core and 57 perimeter, running from the basement to the roof. For the building to have collapsed the way it did, all 81 of these columns had to collapse simultaneously. Could fires on a few floors have heated up all these columns to the breaking point at the same time? Let's ask the 9/11 Commission.
Governor Keene, may I ask another question, please? At 5:20 p.m. on September 11th, World Trade Center building number 7, 47-story modern frame steel skyscraper that no plane hit, collapsed into a neat little pile onto itself and exhibiting all the characteristics of controlled demolition. FEMA, in their investigation, didn't say that. They said that fire must have knocked it down, but they couldn't figure out how. Video evidence shows what appears to be explosive squids going up the side of the building from south to north or from bottom to top as the building collapsed. There was molten metal found in the basement of that building at temperatures that exceeded anything normal fire could cause. With all the confusion about what happened to Building 7, why is there not a word about the collapse of that building in the 911 Commission report?
We didn't see any evidence of the kind of thing you're talking about. We thought that was part of the tragedy of 9/11. The building collapsed later on. There was not a loss of life in that building. And it was not part of our report.
Not part of the report. Thanks.
Governor? So for the 9/11 Commission to totally ignore that, I think is unconscionable and shows that they did not do a thorough job.
Did Building 7 collapse because of damage from the falling North Tower? Or was it also a controlled demolition?
Die moesten het doen terwijl het binnen nog brandde.
Ja, dat is vreemd. Dat is vreemd.
De reactie op de beelden die we laten zien is onbevangen.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Dat kan geen waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja? Hebben ze hard gewerkt.
Okay, so that was Building 7. Obvious controlled demolition, falls right in on itself, middle of the roof first, as if all of the internal support columns were blown. So now let's talk about the Pentagon. So you may recall there were allegedly 4 hijacked jets. We're going to talk about that later. Let's talk about the Pentagon. That was the third. 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, 1 the Pentagon, and then there was Flight 93 that crashed into a field in Shanksville. It seemed to be headed towards Washington also, but didn't make it. Very strange stuff there. But before we get into Flight 93, let's talk about Flight 77, the Pentagon. What happened here? So things to note, Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, his testimony about Dick Cheney, this is crucial. The extra turn that the plane took on its flight path. So instead of, as the plane was coming in to hit the Pentagon, instead of just crashing directly into the middle of the Pentagon, it turned almost a complete circle, 330 degrees. Circle, of course, being 360 degrees. So it comes in, circles the Pentagon, going extremely fast, and then hits the only section of the Pentagon that recently had been reinforced to withstand this type of attack or damage, and consequently had very few people in it. The only reinforced zone. Not only the fact that this turn, many of the people watching it on radar thought it was a military plane. It was so precise, and the way that it was maneuvering. Many pilots have said since, there's a forum, I think, called just simply Pilots for 9/11 Truth, who are professional pilots, and they say they've flown these kinds of planes, and they're like school buses. Like they can't do acrobatics. It's likely the plane would just fall out of the sky, let alone the way that it came in, didn't hit the lawn, as you will see. What hit the Pentagon? Was it actually a 7? Like, there's clear footage of what hit the Twin Towers. There is not clear footage of what hit the Pentagon, which is interesting. You'll see in the video, the FBI says there are probably 85 videos. They confiscated them from security cameras and things, hotels and gas stations on that side of the building. They won't release any of them. The only things they've released show very unclear images that do not clearly show a plane. I edited the what hit the Pentagon part out somewhat. If you want to see the whole thing, just look at the link. I just took it out of mine. And then there is, I think, another coincidence that doesn't seem like a coincidence. There was a Pentagon war game called MASCOW, Mass Casualty Exercise. One of the guys involved in that, Charles Burlingame, was the pilot of the plane on 9/11. Is that a coincidence? I don't think that's a coincidence. Let's watch the video.
And in terms of what motivated me to bring all the aircraft down, as you see one thing happen, that's an accident. When you see two of the same thing occur, it's a pattern. But when you see three of the same thing occur, it's a program. And so at that point, I decided to bring all the aircraft down.
And so, at 9:45, all airborne planes were forced to land. This order applied to all civilian aircraft. Certain military planes were allowed to remain airborne. By 12:16 that afternoon, the FAA managed to ground over 4,000 planes without incident.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
9:37, Arlington, Virginia. American Airlines Flight 77 allegedly crashes into the ground floor of the Pentagon. Pentagon authorities will deny that the building had anti-aircraft defense. The FBI arrives within minutes, and the site is declared a federal crime scene, becoming their exclusive responsibility. With the help of civilians, they comb the Pentagon lawn for debris, and within 24 hours, they had confiscated every known video of the attack. Pentagon officials initially denied that any of their cameras captured the event. However, on March 7, 2002, 5 images taken by a security camera from across the heliport are released. For years, these 5 frames were the only public footage of the Pentagon attack. This would change on October 14, 2004, when Scott Bingham would file a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit requesting videotapes that captured the impact of Flight 77. Special Agent Jacqueline McGuire of the FBI located a CD-ROM that contains copies of 2 time-lapse recordings made by security cameras, released on March 16, 2006. A video taken from a Citgo gas station, which is open only to Pentagon employees, released on September 15, 2006. And the Doubletree Hotel in Arlington, Virginia, released on December 7, 2006. Agent McGuire concluded that the FBI possessed 85 videotapes that might be potentially responsive. As of this date, we have no clear images of what happened at the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11. The official story goes as such. American Airlines Flight 77 was taken over by 5 hijackers, led by Hani Hanjour. Hanjour entered the United States in 1996 to become a professional airline pilot. He would not complete a single course.
It was kind of a waste of time. He wouldn't show up for flights on time, didn't do his homework.
Average or below average piloting skills. English was very poor, uneventful from our perspective.
The 9/11 Commission concludes that Hanjour was perhaps the most experienced and highly trained pilot. Flight 93's hijacker, Saeed Al-Ghamdi, was a former Saudi fighter pilot. How could Hanjour be more experienced than him? On the morning of 9/11, Hani Hanjour and his 4 accomplices traveled to Dulles International Airport outside of Washington, D.C. They had spent the weeks beforehand at the Valencia Motel in Laurel, Maryland, 6 miles from the National Security Agency. All 5 will set off metal detectors and be subjected to additional screening, yet all of them proceed to board American Airlines Flight 77, which is described by the Washington Post as unusually light on passengers. Out of 188 seats, 64 would be filled. In fact, all 4 planes involved in 9/11 would be at approximately 30% capacity. The hijackers will board alongside Barbara Olson, the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson, and a number of employees from Boeing, Raytheon, the Department of Defense, Lockheed Martin, American Airlines, the Navy, Army, and other government agencies. The pilots were Officer David Charlebois and Captain Charles Burlingame. Charles Frank Burlingame III, an aeronautical engineer and a graduate of both the Naval Academy and Top Gun Fighter Pilot School, flew F-4 fighter jets and developed anti-terrorism strategies at the Pentagon before retiring in 1989 to take a job at American Airlines. He would remain active in the reserves and anti-terrorism exercises until 1996. His Boeing 757 would be crashed into the very section of the Pentagon he used to work in. The hijackers would have only moments to subdue both Charlebois and Burlingame, remove them from the cockpit, and retain control of the airplane. Yet, the plane is hijacked without incident at 8:51 and makes an unauthorized turn to the south 3 minutes later. No mayday, no hijack code, no sign of struggle. Flight 77 will fly all the way back from the Kentucky-Ohio border, coasting for another 43 minutes against its flight path before crashing into the Pentagon without any military interception. Had Hani Hanjour wanted to inflict maximum damage, all he had to do was continue his trajectory and nose down into the roof of the Pentagon. Instead, he begins a complicated 330-degree turn, dropping 7,000 feet and exposing himself for an additional 3 minutes while executing a maneuver described by experienced pilots as nearly impossible, requiring professional expertise. In essence, an amateur pilot considered a waste of resources by instructors, who was unable to control a small Cessna in August 2001, executed this nearly impossible maneuver in a 757 with skilled precision a month later.
Todd Lewis is working radar at Dulles Airport.
One of my colleagues saw a target moving from northwest to the southeast.
And it was just a countdown, 10 miles west.
And she notified the supervisor.
9 miles west.
But nobody knew that was a commercial flight at the time. Nobody knew that was American 77.
What did you think? It was a military flight of some kind?
I thought it was a military flight. I thought that Langley had scrambled some fighters and...
It was almost a sense of relief. This must be a fighter.
maybe one of them got up there.
It was really moving fast.
It was moving very fast, like a military aircraft might move at a low altitude.
This must be one of our guys, sent in, scrambled to patrol our capital.
The 757 will descend over Columbia Pike, flying adjacent to the Sheraton Hotel, Virginia Department of Transportation, Navy Annex, and fly past the Citgo gas station before crossing Washington Boulevard. 5 light poles are knocked out of the ground. One reportedly strikes a Washington, D.C. taxi driven by Lloyd England. Flight 77 manages to hit the only section that was reinforced to withstand a terrorist attack, including reinforced steel and blast-resistant Kevlar windows an 1.5 inches thick. The renovation, planning for which had begun in 1991, was only days away from completion. Had the plane struck anywhere else, the casualties and damage would have been far greater. An area that normally would have housed up to 5,000 occupants yielded 125 casualties. The Pentagon's outer wall had a hole approximately 20 feet in diameter on the first and second floor, and visible damage 90 feet across the first floor.
I would say if it was 16 feet diameter, 20 feet tops, that's what would start me so curious. As I was trying to find something, there was no marks on the grass. Something never hit the ground. It didn't hit the heliport. I mean, it was a precision or awfully lucky hit. I mean, I don't know how it didn't bounce. I don't know how it hit directly in the side of the building without touching the ground, going as fast as it obviously was going. But I can't believe the thing is more than a garage door. And again, the classic airplane crash has wreckage. I mean, they found axles from the Ryder truck in Oklahoma City. I can't believe they can't find an engine.
Those that think a 757 did not hit are fueled by the damage to the building and lack of large structural debris outside, particularly the lack of damage from the wings and vertical stabilizer, and the fact that those objects, as well as the engines, were never fully recovered.
Is there anything left of the aircraft at all?
First of all, the question about the aircraft, there are some small pieces of aircraft visible from the interior during this firefighting operation that I'm talking about, but not large sections. In other words, there's no fuselage sections and that sort of thing.
They said it was a plane, and I didn't see any pieces of any plane, and I couldn't believe that a plane hit the building.
There are numerous parts to a 757 that are virtually indestructible. To date, we have not seen a single piece positively identified as Flight 77's. The fact that an exit hole inside the Pentagon is not explained by any official report on the attack. The fact that there was no impact damage on the lawn. And the fact that out of the videos that have been released, none of them clearly show a 757. The outer wall will collapse 20 minutes later, leaving a hole approximately 70 feet wide. What hit the building may be important. However, our focus should be on why it was hit in the first place. The section hit was the headquarters of Naval Operations, Naval Intelligence, and the Navy Command Center. Army personnel were also killed. A number of accountants and budget analysts were also present at the time and killed in the attack. The Arlington County After Action Report states that important budget information was in the damaged area. It's interesting that 24 hours prior, Donald Rumsfeld publicly made this announcement.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
According to the 9/11 Commission report, the military was unprepared for the transformation of commercial aircraft into weapons of mass destruction.
Counterterrorism forecaster Marvin Citron authored a report in 1994 for the Department of Defense, warning of Washington's vulnerability to terrorist attack.
We predicted a plane could have crashed into the Pentagon. That's about as specific as you can be. If you made a right turn at the Washington Monument, you could hit the Pentagon. A left turn, you could hit the White House.
Back on October 24th, 2000, the Pentagon conducted MASCAL, a mass casualty exercise which simulated the impact of a Boeing 757 into the building.
very curious, and as time goes by, it makes you more curious as you have time to dwell on the details and all the information that's becoming available. I can't drive my car that well, but I can't imagine somebody just climbing behind the wheel of an airplane and doing what they did and doing it so well. Basically, it was the strangest day I've ever spent in my entire life. It was like in slow motion. I get chills every time I hear the audio. I physically, I swear I get chills every time I watch the video. I can feel the heat, I can smell the fuel, or I can smell the burning. There's been a lot of curiosity, I think, in time, and even for me who was there. I still have questions of, did I really see what I think I saw? You know, when you're led to believe and you think you believe what you think you saw, I think that you begin to buy into it. But the more you dwell on it and the more the evidence comes forward, the questions get larger and larger and larger. I'd like some conclusion. I mean, I'm sure the families would, and I'm sure the military knows a lot more than we do in the government. But I'm just astounded that they don't share more of the information that's available.
If the government was 100% forthcoming and wanted to squelch any doubt as to what happened, why have they controlled the evidence so strongly? Why is there no positive identification of Flight 77? Why, when Vice President Dick Cheney was aware of an incoming aircraft up to 50 miles away, were employees allowed to remain in the building? Had a single alarm gone off inside the Pentagon, 125 people would be alive today, and hundreds more would not be suffering.
And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, "Do the orders still stand?" And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?"
Norman Minetta's testimony would be completely unreported by the 9/11 Commission. It would also be censored from the online archives of Commission hearings. A spokesperson from the National Archive claimed that it was a technical snafu. The 9/11 Commission will later conclude that Vice President Dick Cheney did not reach the bunker until 9:58.
My main concern is that in your testimony, you stated that Vice President Dick Cheney came into the POEC office at 9:20 when you arrived, and he was already there. He's gone in front of Meet the Press, and he said that he was there at 9:38.
They did that because they'd received a report that an airplane was headed for the White House.
This is Flight 77, which had left Dulles.
Flight 77. It left Dulles. As best we can tell, they came initially at the White House.
The plane actually circled the White House?
Didn't circle it, but was headed on a track into it.
Tracking it by radar.
And when it entered the danger zone and looked like it was headed for the White House was when they grabbed me and evacuated me to the basement. The plane obviously didn't hit the White House, turned away and we think flew a circle and came back in and then hit the Pentagon.
Yeah, the 9/11 Commission report puts him there at 9:58 that morning.
9:58?
Yeah, I don't know if you got a chance to read it, but it puts him half an hour later. So I don't mean to ask a rhetorical question, but to the best of your recollection, was Vice President Dick Cheney already there at 9:20?
The flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
This was before Flight 77.
Before American Airlines went into the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Norman Minetta was in the bunker with Cheney, and so the fact that wasn't in the 9/11 Commission report was rather odd, don't you think? Yeah. Who was that young man? Did anybody ask who that young man was?
How could Dick Cheney, or anyone in the administration, especially after an aide warned him a plane was 50 miles out and 2 planes had already struck the World Trade Center, allow the Pentagon to be struck?
Okay, so there's the Pentagon. There used to be a nice little flash animation called Pentastrike. I could not find it, but that was a somewhat humorous take on the whole thing. What happened at the Pentagon, we do not know. Was it a missile? Was it a plane? I don't know, but I personally, I don't think it was the 757 or whatever. I think it was either some kind of small drone or a missile, but the whole story is bizarre. Why weren't these planes intercepted, for starters? We're going to talk about that later on. Again, I wanted to put more of the physical evidence up front here and then try to answer some of the questions with the discussion. In Loose Change, it's sort of the opposite. They do some background first. So now let's turn our attention to the last of the hijacked flights, air quotes around hijacked flights, Flight 93. This is the one that allegedly crashed into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Again, was not intercepted, but this is going to be a mashup of first footage from Loose Change Final Cut and then from Second Edition. I think that the Flight 93 section of Loose Change Second Edition is much more speculative. However, I did include what I included because I think that it was of value. What you're going to hear here is primarily the bizarre nature of the crash site, air quotes, where none of the debris was larger than a phone book, unquote. Remember phone books? Multiple debris sites 8 miles apart. Quotes saying it looked like somebody dug a ditch and dumped a bunch of scrap metal into it about 15 feet by 10 feet. Like a big gouge in the earth with some broken trees. And there's absolutely no historical precedent for this sort of disintegration. Loose Change Second Edition goes into a theory with evidence that Flight 93 actually was landed at another airport, and the whole thing it's just bizarre. So let's watch.
All right, some new information coming in. Report from Associated Press of a large plane crashing in western Pennsylvania. This is according to officials at the Somerset County Airport. A large plane crashing in western Pennsylvania.
We had that plane crash. I'm sorry, go ahead, Skip.
Say it again. Repeat, please, Skip.
I'm saying somebody may have made that horrible decision to go ahead and take the plane down.
(10:03 a.m.) Shanksville, Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 allegedly plows into an abandoned strip mine at 580 miles per hour. 20 minutes flying time from Washington, D.C. Originally, the official story is that passengers on board the plane overthrew the hijackers and sacrificed themselves to prevent further casualties. The 9/11 Commission will later conclude that hijacker Ziad Jarrah, anticipating a cockpit overthrow, crashes the plane into the ground. Debris from Flight 93 was found considerable distances from the crash site.
The debris here is spread over a 3 to 4 mile radius, which has now been completely sealed off and is being treated, according to the FBI, as a crime scene. This is one of those cases where the pictures really do tell the story, that sort of the most horrifying aspect of this particular crash scene is how little debris is visible. That's really all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris. There has been at least one report that the investigators out there, and there are hundreds of them, as I said tonight, have found nothing larger than a phone book.
Well, Darren, in the last hour or so, the FBI and the state police here have confirmed that they have cordoned off a second area about 6 to 8 miles away from the crater here where this plane went down. This is apparently another debris site, which raises a number of questions. Why would debris from the plane, and they identified it specifically as being from this plane, why would debris be located 6 miles away? Could it have blown that far away? Seems highly unlikely. Almost all the debris found at this site is within 100 yards, 200 yards away. So it raises some questions. We don't want to over-speculate, of course.
It seems to me from covering a number of plane crashes on the scene that, if nothing else, you can say this is not typical for a plane crash to be spread across an area this large.
It certainly doesn't make sense because most of the debris has been found in a very compact area within 100 yards, 200 yards, maybe a little beyond that. And then all of a sudden they're telling us 6 miles away they have another concentration of debris. They say it's very small pieces. Most of these are very small pieces. Most of the pieces here are no bigger than the size of a briefcase, they say, and the pieces 6 miles away maybe even smaller than that.
Did they find a plane in Shanksville?
Within the last hour. I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. From where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire. Just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet long and probably about 10 feet long or 10 feet wide.
What could you see on the ground, if anything, other than dirt and ash? And
you couldn't see anything. You could just see dirt, ash, and people walking around, broken trees.
From the Somerset County coroner to the mayor of Shanksville, almost every eyewitness would remark how little of the plane and its passengers remained.
But when I got there, I wondered to myself, where is it? There was just, the plane was just totally disintegrated. The only thing we didn't see were people.
Nothing to indicate that there was even anybody on the plane.
I remember asking a state trooper that was there to be sure, is that where the plane went down? It was so hard to tell because there was nothing around.
The Pennsylvania state website puts it best. It is difficult to believe that a 757 plunged into the ground with such force that the plane literally disintegrated and created a still, smoldering crater. Is there any historical precedent for a commercial airliner disintegrating upon impact?
The emergency services realize their task is hopeless. John Heavey and his team confront the horror of the scene. The twisted wreckage of 191 lies scattered for hundreds of meters. Debris had smashed into the trailer park, destroying 5 homes.
In 1988, Pan Am 103 exploded in mid-air over the town of Lockerbie in Scotland, killing 270 people. Terrorists checked a bag containing a bomb into the hold, but didn't board the plane. The sea below them is on fire.
Saying that the pilot was able to dump fuel over Jamaica Bay.
It immediately veered over to the right and it came nose down only a block away from where I was working.
And the room just exploded. My daughter got blown through the patio doors. My wife got blown into the living room and I got blown out the patio doors behind my daughter.
Several blocks away from the primary crash scene, the aircraft may have been rocked by vibrations severe enough to knock the engines off the wings.
Jim, let me just tell our audience what you're looking at. These are from Jamaica Bay. This is clearly a part of the plane.
Yes, that would be the horizontal stabilizer, the vertical tail fin on the back of the airplane.
In 2006, during the trial of Zacharias Moussaoui, the FBI managed to provide a multitude of evidence that appears to have survived a catastrophic crash in near pristine condition. Among the exhibits were a red bandana, a Kingdom of Saudi Arabia driver's license, John Talignani's driver's license, and flight attendant C.C. Lyle's personal effects, including her driver's license and Marriott hotel card. Although a 757 managed to obliterate itself upon impact, paper and fabric managed to survive without a scratch. They also released pictures of an engine and 2 pieces of fuselage. It is not specified where those were found. Once again, the FBI stepped in to supervise every aspect of the investigation. They repeatedly denied family members' requests to listen to the cockpit voice recorder. The FBI gave in on April 18, 2002, as long as the victims' relatives didn't talk about it. And for some reason, the last 3 minutes were unaccounted for. No explanation has been given. Even after Zacharias Moussaoui's sentencing, the actual cockpit voice recorder has yet to be released. The 9/11 Commission concludes that the military was not informed of Flight 93 until 10:07, minutes after it had crashed.
We heard the explosion. Actually, our power had gone off, and then we felt a tremor. We had just gotten up, and the next thing I know, it sounded like a missile came across our house. I mean, they were going that fast. It was flying. It was coming from that direction. I have no idea what it was. Oh no, it wasn't. It wasn't the aircraft that crashed. No, it's hard for me to believe that they did not know about that aircraft until 10:07. That's difficult for me to believe.
Despite the discussions about military assistance, no one from FAA headquarters requested military assistance regarding United 93, nor did any manager at FAA headquarters pass any of the information it had about United 93 to the military.
A year after 9/11, military officials were telling an entirely different story, that Flight 93 was being tracked.
In the Pentagon Command Center, there's a report of another hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 93.
We received a report from the FAA that Flight 93 had turned off its transponder, had turned, and was now heading towards Washington, D.C. The decision was made to try to go intercept Flight 93.
The rules have changed. We could do something about it now.
Colonel Bob Marr is in command at the Northeast Air Defense Sector base in Rome, New York.
The words that I remember as clear as day was, "We will take lives in the air to preserve lives on the ground."
Marr orders his air controllers tell the pilots to intercept Flight 93.
United Airlines Flight 93 will not be allowed to reach Washington, D.C.
The closure time came and went, and nothing had happened. So you can imagine everything was very tense.
Flight 93 is about 175 miles north and west of Washington, flying over Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Up above, a fighter jet streaks by.
It was about 10:03 that the fighters reported that Flight 93 had crashed.
Eventually, of course, we never fired on any aircraft.
When you heard the plane was down without a shot being fired at it, do you remember what you said?
We just witnessed an act of heroism.
Was Flight 93 downed by hijackers in an open field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania? Or is the truth being withheld from the public? Next, what about the cell phone calls? For starters, the calls themselves are extremely peculiar. Most of them are only a couple sentences long before the callers end the conversation, only to call back later. Flight attendant Betty Ong allegedly placed a call from Flight 11. According to the 9/11 Commission, although the conversation lasted 23 minutes, only 4.5 minutes was recorded.
I can't hear you.
Sure. What is your name?
Okay, my name is Betty Ong. I'm number 3 on Flight 11.
Okay.
And the cockpit is not answering their phones. And there's somebody stabbed in business class, and we can't breathe in business class. Somebody's got mace or something. Okay. Our number 1 got stabbed. Our purser is stabbed. Nobody knows who stabbed who, and we can't even get up to business class right now because nobody can breathe. Our number 1 is stabbed right now.
Okay.
And our number 5, our first class passengers, our first class galley flight attendant and our purser has been stabbed. And we can't get a cockpit. The door won't open.
Does Miss Ong sound like a woman on a hijacked plane who just saw 3 people murdered? Why is nobody in the background screaming? Flight attendant Madeline Sweeney allegedly talked with her ground manager Michael Woodward for 25 minutes. She describes 4 hijackers. The FBI says there were 5. She says the hijackers were in rows 9 and 10. The FAA says they were all in row 8. A man claiming to be Mark Bingham called his mother Alice, who was visiting his sister-in-law. The caller says, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham. When was the last time you called your mother and used your full name? I just want to tell you that I love you. I'm on a flight from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys on board, and they have taken over the plane, and they say they have a bomb. I'm calling you from the airphone." And then, "You believe me, don't you, Mom?" "Yes, Mark, I believe you. Who are these guys?" Then he was interrupted by someone who was speaking in a low-toned male voice, speaking what sounded like English. After 30 seconds of muffled sounds, the caller repeats, "I'm calling you with an airphone." His mother asks him again, "Who are these guys?" After another pause, he returns and asks again, "You believe me, don't you, Mom?" There was another pause, and the phone just trailed off. But to be honest, none of that matters. Why? Because none of these calls could have possibly taken place. Key Dudney of Physics911.net conducted some research of his own. In an experiment called Project Achilles, he took a series of cell phones onto a Cessna 172 and flew up to 8,000 feet. At 4,000 feet, he had a 0.4 success rate. At 8,000 feet, he had a 0.1 success rate. For 32,000 feet, cruising altitude for a commercial airliner, he calculated a 0.006 success rate, less than 1 in 100th of a chance. Don't believe me? Even American Airlines has put their foot in the government's mouth. On July 15, 2004, passengers aboard a commercial American Airlines flight were able to send and receive calls from their cell phones as if they were on the ground, thanks to a cell station that was installed into the plane. It worked great. I called the office, I called my wife, I called a friend in Paris. They all heard me great, and I could hear them loud and clear. Why would Calcom and American Airlines spend thousands of dollars on this technology in 2004 when cell phones worked so well on September 11, 2001? The cell phone calls were fake. No question about it. So how is it possible to fake a person's voice? In 1999, the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico revealed their voice morphing technology. General Carl W. Steiner, the former Commander-in-Chief of United States Special Operations, declared on tape, "Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government." Another example was Colin Powell saying, "I am being treated well by my captors." With just a 10-minute recording of somebody's voice, they were able, in almost real time, to clone someone's speech. Steiner was so impressed, he asked for a copy.
So there you go. You have some exposure to this. I highly recommend, and I think I'm going to be mirroring them on the channel, I highly recommend you go watch Loose Change 2nd Edition and then watch Loose Change Final Cut, because they're in some ways very different movies. I think there's very different information in each, so while there is some redundancy, you will get more, much more out of watching both. I think that as the 9/11 Truth movement went mainstream, producers were reluctant to get into some of the more speculative stuff as time went on. Loose Change 2nd Edition, I think it's a little more powerful. It's a little more off the cuff. Yeah, there's a few things that are more speculative, but I think it's harder hitting in some ways, though there also are merits to Final Cut because it came out like a year and a half later and therefore had new information, because this was a movement and it was picking up new evidence all the time as more people jumped into the fray, made new discoveries. As I told you, I participated in this personally. It was exciting. I mean, it was an exciting time because we felt like we were, I was devastated to see the far right turn that the Bush administration took America on. And while the fucking liberals sat around like jerking themselves off, we were actually trying to do something, trying to get the public inoculated against all the terrorism, fear-mongering, imperialistic bullshit of just let's invade whatever country we want, the kind of torture that was going on in Abu Ghraib, like getting people not to buy into this. And, of course, then the economic crash in 2008, we had to shift to like talking about the economy at that point. But the 2000s were the decade of the war on terror. It was a decade of war. It was a decade of lies and justifications for war. And the 9/11 Truth movement was out there fighting it. Yes, there were plants in the movement. Yes, there were nuts in the movement. But there's also plenty of reasonable people doing research on what the military-industrial complex is actually up to. For decades, the military-industrial complex has been completely unaccountable. I don't recall if I showed you the clip, but it's in one of these editions of Loose Change, that Donald Rumsfeld, which I don't know how this guy got rehabbed or even just de facto rehab by not being vilified anymore. That guy should be vilified every day to this day, and no one even says his name anymore. But he announced on September 10th, the day before the attacks, that like $2 trillion, over $2 trillion was missing from the Pentagon budget. That was an amount that had been growing over years, but that they couldn't account for this money. And there were books written in the past in the 80s about the invisible government or the secret team. What is this? Well, it's basically black books, CIA stuff that they were just taking money from the government and building like a private, unaccountable army. Now we have things like Blackwater and stuff like that was starting to make its appearance in the 2000s, but that was fairly unprecedented at the time. But for decades prior, there was all this off-book CIA stuff that they were building their own army, their own navy. And this came out in some of the Iran-Contra stuff where these ostensibly, U.S. government sanctioned things were operating under immense amounts of cover and confidentiality. And then they were doing highly illegal stuff to fund themselves more. And the Iran-Contra scandal involved people in the Reagan administration, Bush administration, and some of these people, like John Poindexter, came back in the George W. Bush years. So I wish that we were still on kind of this level of research in the movement. Unfortunately, the U.S. is falling apart. I mean, just even looking back 15 years from 2020 to 2005, when these documentaries were coming out, I mean, just the U.S. was so much more stable. I can't even tell you. It was not great, but it was more stable than it is today. Things are bad. They're going to keep getting bad. And we as socialists, read your theory, prepare, because shit is going to keep coming down. And I will tell you, back in the 2000s, people were speculating on that. The country as a whole has been right-wing for like a long time. The actual left has been small and pretty terrible. It was easier to connect with a libertarian in the 2000s than it was with an actual Marxist. Just have always been few and far between, but, it just kind of got especially buried after the destruction of the Soviet Union. And so here we are trying to expose the military-industrial complex, and it's like there's no movement. And we've got to get that going again. And I'm going to leave it there. This has been Socialism for All. Please, again, watch Loose Change 2nd Edition and Final Cut. I'll see if I can mirror them here on the YouTube. Thanks to our current patrons. I really appreciate your support. There are 7 of you right now. That list is growing. And I appreciate all of the donations are encouraging. Of course, the more actual money I get, the more time I can spend on this. Please remember to follow us also, facebook.com/socialism for all. Facebook has been fucking hard with the S4A page. It's been stopping our distribution in news feeds. It's been making me unable to comment as S4A in other groups, actually even in my own groups. So that kind of sucks. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, help spread these videos, because I don't even know if, S4A is going to be on Facebook. I mean, I'm going to leave it up, but I don't know if they're going to, take down the page at some point with the way that things are going. Actually, I just put 2 articles up on exposés on how right-wing Facebook administration and like their governance team is. So not looking good. Facebook really is a right-wing echo chamber, and Reddit is just kind of crap. Anyway, thanks again for listening. 9/11 was an inside job. We'll be doing more on this leading up to the 20th anniversary next year.